A terrorist murder of a young woman took place in Moscow last night to scarcely concealed glee amongst the Western commentariat, absolute silence from the Western political leaders, and unadorned, unrestrained singing and dancing from the partisans of the Ukrainian nationalist movement around the world. Many of them otherwise describing themselves as liberals, even progressives, one or two, even socialists. But they are rejoicing in the evisceration, the tearing to pieces of a young woman killed in a car bomb attack in the Russian capital of Moscow, for reasons which I'll now go into. But let me just opine on the wicked, evil double standards of Western correspondents, commentators and politicians when it comes to terrorism. If the Palestinians had blown up the daughter of an Israeli journalist, if the Iranians had blown up the child of a Western politician or an Israeli politician, if Irish dissident terrorists had blown up the daughter of a British political figure from the long and bloodied history, for example, of Britain in Ireland, the entire Western media and commentariat would be up in arms. Retaliation would already be underway. Instead, there is a scarcely concealed and not even very enigmatic smile on the face of Western people and way too many of the Western public at the destruction of the young life of Yugina, of the daughter of the Russian nationalist commentator, philosopher they call him, and television mogul at one time, Alexander Dugan. I'll come to him in a minute because there are some important things you need to know about him. But ponder this. The Western liberal is still in a scarcely simmering spasm of outrage at the attempted murder, not of Salman Rushdie's son or daughter, but of Salman Rushdie himself. Everyone, including me, utterly condemned it, demanded that action be taken, that further marginalization of Iran, for example, must be the result of an individual's attempt to murder Salman Rushdie on a New York stage just a couple of weeks ago, indeed less than that. The spasm had scarcely died down when an actual murder, not of Dugan, but of Dugan's daughter, took place last night to, as I've said, almost unalloyed glee. This is an important lesson that will not have been lost in Russia or in the world. This vividly demonstrates the utter, cynical, immoral, wicked, evil hypocrisy of the West when it comes to the spilling of blood. It is a sick piece of hypocrisy to denounce the attack on Rushdie and welcome the attack on the daughter of Alexander Dugan. And it will not have been missed by those now plotting their revenge. Even if you leave aside the morality of taking pleasure in the murder of a young girl because of the perceived sins of her father, what about the self-interest? Because let me break some bad news to some bad people. This murder will be avenged, and it will be avenged on the equally innocent children of some of you. It will be avenged on the equally innocent daughters and sons of Western politicians, Western philosophers, Western journalists and commentators? Are there no rules left anymore? Have they no decency at all left within them? Or perhaps, as Mr. Gandhi pointed out when asked what he thought of Western civilization, his reply, yes, that would be a good idea, was always the apt and the apposite response. Because this murder of Eugenia is not the only sign that the war in Ukraine just took a dramatic turn for the worse. Russian soldiers, by the score, are being rushed to hospital with what appears to be biological or chemical poisoning. Laughingly, the Ukrainian authorities suggested that they had all eaten a bad curry or words to that effect. But they know, and you know, that that's not really true. The soldiers concerned did not all eat the same food. They were spread out across very many miles of the front on which they were fighting, and they have all gone down with exactly the same symptoms of chemical and biological weapons. Now, for context, you need to recall something that happened in the ancient history of just a few weeks ago, when on entering Ukraine, it was discovered that the United States had set up a chain of biomedical, they say bioweapon installations, institutions, right on the border with Russia. In an absolutely grotesque and bizarre turn of events, it turned out that those biolabs were funded by Hunter Biden, the son of the President of the United States of America, now in a state of war in the very same Ukraine with the very same Russia. The revelation by Russian media was treated by the usual suspects on the left, amongst the progressives and the liberals and the Guardians and the New York Times, as hyperbole, until Victoria Nuland herself confirmed the existence of these biolabs, 20 of them, seeded throughout Ukrainian territory on the border with Russia, in a country that's been being built up for the last 8 years, longer actually, but 8 years in fifth gear as the vehicle of confrontation of choice between NATO and the Russian Federation. So we've got biolabs, we've got alleged botulism, and we've now got scores of Russian victims of chemical and biological weapons. As I said on the last item about the daughter of Dugan, forget about the morality of that. Forget the wicked, evil people involved in doing that. Forget their wickedness and their evil. What about the self-interest? Because this too will be retaliated against. If the Ukraine with American involvement is using chemical and biological weapons against Russia, Russia will use chemical and biological weapons against us, against Ukrainian forces, and against mercenaries from NATO countries, and yes, against NATO personnel, installations, embassies, institutes of all kinds seeded throughout the western part of Ukraine. Are there no rules anymore? Are there no laws anymore? Have they no decency? I ask for a second time. And thirdly, and most portentously of all, despite the idiots, few of them are idiots, most of them are rats, in the mainstream media, continuing to report, as if by mistake, that Russia is shelling a nuclear power plant which it has actually occupied with its own forces for the last 3 months. Yet still they report that Russia is shelling a nuclear power plant it controls and occupies. It is becoming clear that the Ukraine intends to shell that nuclear power plant and deliberately create a devastating environmental, human, medical, social catastrophe. A Chernobyl, a new Chernobyl in the heart of Europe, carried out by a regime and its forces owned, bought, paid for, armed, proselytized for by us. We are therefore going to be, this coming week, responsible for a nuclear catastrophe. And we learn from Big Toby, well named, Elwood, the Conservative MP today, that any leak of radiation from that power plant will be treated as an Article 5 of the NATO Charter offense and create a state of war between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Russian Federation. An open invitation to Zelensky and his gang to deliberately create that radiation leak, knowing now that the chairman of the British Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee has said that any such radiation leak will bring NATO officially, formally, and wholeheartedly into the war. Forget about the rules for a minute. Forget about the laws for a minute. Forget about the morality for a minute. Is there no understanding of what the consequences of this will be? That an all-out war between NATO and Russia means an all-out war between you and Russia and you. Don't imagine for one single minute that that would be a one-sided war. Don't imagine for a single minute that Russia and its allies will not retaliate, all guns blazing and, if necessary, nuclear guns blazing. Have they no sense? Never mind decency. Have they no idea the precipice on which we currently stand? Well, the politicians do as it happens. The military top brass do as it happens. But the public do not. And unless you're watching this show, you don't know any of what I have just said to you. And whilst 1 million people watch this show, that means billions do not. It means that by closing down all alternative voices that they could, by shutting television stations, closing newspapers, putting people out of business, defunding them, deplatforming them, shadow banning them, that the vast majority of the public know nothing of which I have just spoken and to which you have just listened. And here's something else they don't know. It is repeated ad nauseum. I've read it 100 times, maybe 500 times today, that the aforementioned Alexander Dugan is Putin's brain, is Putin's philosopher is the man operating Vladimir Putin, and that therefore the murder of his daughter is somehow justified because of your obsession with Putin. I'm going to break you some news that virtually nobody in the West knows. Dugan has never met or spoken to Putin ever in his life. I have met and spoken to Vladimir Putin far more often, meaning twice, than Alexander Dugan, never mind his daughter, now deceased. May she rest in peace. The lie machine never stops. Lies by omission. You just don't get told the truth. Lies by commission, by the deliberate inflation of the role of Dugan so that you can justify his murder or, as it's turned out, the murder of his daughter. So I hate to say this, as a father myself and as an absolute opponent of terrorism, any terrorism, all places, anytime, you better lock up your sons and your daughters, because the revenge for Dugina will be swift and will be terrible. I only have time to mention in passing something else that you're not being told. Imran Khan, the legitimate Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, is now in grave danger. His liberty and even his life is in danger. Why? Because having been brought down in a US regime change operation, an imported government of wanted criminals placed in his stead in power in Pakistan, he has refused to go quietly into that good night. His supporters have teamed in their tens of millions onto the streets of Pakistan and demanded his reinstatement through immediate, free and fair general elections, which everybody knows he would win in a landslide. Dr. Shabazz Gill, a professor from the University of Illinois in the United States, and the right-hand man of Imran Khan, is currently being tortured in a Pakistani dungeon. He's on a stretcher, being tortured for being the right-hand man of Imran Khan. And reports are circulating this very evening that the rightful and legitimate Prime Minister of Pakistan is facing imminent arrest. Now, I have lived through this movie before, several times, in fact, in my long involvement with Pakistan going back to the 1970s and the judicial murder of the martyr Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on the gallows of the Western-supported dictator General Zia-ul-Haq. I saw what they did to Mr. Bhutto. I campaigned for his life. It broke my heart when he dangled like strange fruit at the end of a rope erected by the hangman Zia-ul-Haq. I received his daughter straight from prison, Benazir Bhutto, on her arrival in London. I was at her side for the next 30 years, and I watched live on television the same Pakistani cesspit of military and intelligence and extremist fanatic nexus murder her. I'm not going to watch the murder of Imran Khan quietly. I now have a big microphone, a big pulpit, and I warn those involved in the attempt to murder democracy in Pakistan. I'm watching, and I will call you out with every last breath that I have. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride.